There is a kind of stubbornness that doesn't look like stubbornness from the outside. It looks like a woman splitting wood before 6 in the morning. It looks like a repaired fence post driven into frozen ground with hands that haven't fully warmed up yet. It looks like a ledger balanced to the last cent, written in handwriting so small and careful that you'd think the person doing it was afraid to waste even the paper. Callum Bryce had seen a lot of things in his 60 years of moving cattle across the Alberta foothills. He had seen drought and flood, and the particular cruelty of a late May frost that killed a calf crop overnight. He had seen men with money lose everything because they were careless, and men without money hold on to everything because they weren't. But he had not seen anything quite like what he found on the morning he rode the back trail between Pincher Creek and the old Whitehorn lease. He wasn't supposed to be on that road at all. The direct route would have taken him along the highway, but the culvert washed out 2 weeks prior had added 40 minutes to every trip through that corridor, and Callum was not a man who accepted 40 extra minutes without looking for another way. The gravel track that cut through the eastern edge of the Whitehorn property was technically a municipal road allowance, open to anyone who knew it existed, which was almost nobody. He knew it because his father had known it, and his father before that. That kind of knowledge doesn't get written down anywhere. It just passes between people who pay attention to the land. The morning was gray and cold, the kind of September cold that is less about temperature and more about the light. Everything flat and even, no shadows, no warmth. His truck moved slow on the gravel, and he almost didn't see the property at all, sitting as it did below the road grade, half screened by a row of old spruce that someone had planted decades ago as a windbreak and that had since grown wild and uneven, some of them leaning hard east from years of prevailing wind. What made him slow down was the woodpile, not the state of the buildings, which were poor, not the fence line along the east side, which had 3 posts down and wire dragging. What made him slow down was the woodpile stacked against the north wall of the house, because it was neat. Not neat the way someone makes a woodpile neat when they have time and energy and nothing pressing. Neat the way someone makes a woodpile neat when they understand that disorder in winter is a form of danger. Round ends faced out, bark side up, the top course angled slightly to shed rain. Whoever had stacked it had learned how to do it correctly, and had done it correctly even when no one was watching. Callum stopped the truck. He sat for a moment looking at the yard. The house needed paint badly. The white was down to bare gray wood in long strips on the south and west faces. The barn roof had a visible sag on the east slope, a kind of slow collapse that had been going on for years, the ridge bowing in the middle like a tired back. One window on the upper floor was covered with a sheet of plywood cut to fit, edges caulked against the weather, but the yard itself was clear. No old machinery left to rust in the grass, no garbage accumulated at the fence corners, no broken things left where they'd fallen. Someone was keeping the place as well as the place could be kept under the circumstances, which were clearly difficult. He didn't see anyone. He almost drove on. Then he noticed the garden. Along the south face of the house, someone had put in a kitchen garden that was long past its summer peak, but had been properly cut back and mulched for winter. Straw laid thick between the rows, the remaining kale and late carrots covered with a length of old window screen, weighted at the corners with stones. Whoever had planted it intended to use every day of the season available to them, and had prepared it to survive past the first frost. That wasn't a garden planted by someone who expected to leave. Callum turned off the truck and got out. He told himself he was going to check the fence. The downed posts on the east line were close to his lease boundary, and if the wire was on his side of the property edge, it was technically his concern anyway. He told himself that, and he knew it was mostly true, and he knew the mostly was doing a lot of work in that sentence. He was halfway to the east fence when the front door of the house opened. She came out without, which told him she'd seen him from inside and come out fast, before she'd had time to think about the cold. She was younger than he'd expected. Late 20s, maybe 30. with the kind of posture that comes from doing physical work every day, shoulders set square, movement economical. She had a smear of what looked like axle grease on her left forearm, and her boots were already laced and muddy, which meant she'd been working before he arrived. She stopped at the edge of the porch and looked at him with a steadiness that was not hostile but was absolutely not soft either. "You're on private property. Not a question. I know it." He stopped walking and kept his distance, the way you do when you want to make clear you're not a threat. "Name's Callum Bryce. I run cattle on the Whitehorn lease north of here. Saw your east fence from the road. I know about the fence," I figured. He looked at the downed posts. I wasn't going to fix it without asking. A pause. She studied him the way someone studies a contract they've been handed without warning. Not suspicious of the person exactly, but careful about the terms. "Wren Pickett," she said finally. She said it the way people say their names when they've gotten used to having to follow it up with something else, some explanation or context, but she didn't follow it up. She left it sitting there, just the name, and waited to see what he'd do with it. "The fence has been down a while," Callum said. "3 posts, maybe 4. If that last one's as loose as it looks from here. You've got wire dragging into the low ground. I know what I've got. Any cattle, you're losing them east by morning. I haven't got cattle." She came down off the porch then, hands going into her back pockets, and walked toward the fence line at an angle that wasn't quite toward him, more toward the problem. He walked with her, keeping a yard between them. Up close, he could see that the fence hadn't just fallen. The posts had been cut. Clean diagonal cuts at the base, done with a chainsaw or a reciprocating saw. Not rot, not weather. Someone had done this deliberately and done it on her side of the line, where she'd be the one dealing with it. He didn't say anything about it. He waited. "I know who did it," Wren said. She was looking at the cut posts with an expression that had gone flat and tight around the eyes. "Same person who's been moving my survey stakes every time I get them reset. What do they want?" She looked at him for the first time with something other than assessment. A flicker of something tired, or maybe resigned. The same thing everyone wants. The land. The Pickett property was 160 acres of mixed terrain, some good pasture along the creek bottom, some marginal upland, and a quarter section of poplar and spruce that had been logged once 50 years ago and had grown back irregular and thick. It wasn't a grand piece of ground by Alberta standards, but it sat at the exact point where a gravel road connected 2 larger properties, and without it, those properties were separated by 12 kilometers of detour. That geometry made the Pickett place worth considerably more to its neighbors than its assessment suggested. Wren's grandmother had homesteaded it. Her mother had grown up on it, left for the city at 19, and spent the next 2 decades looking back. When the grandmother died, the property had passed to Wren's mother, who had lasted 1 winter before her health gave out. Wren had come back to close the estate and found herself unable to leave. She did not explain all of this to Callum that morning. He pieced most of it together later, from the county records office and from conversations with the older men at the coffee shop in Pincher Creek who had known the family. What she told him that first morning was only the immediate arithmetic. No cattle, some hay bales sold off from last year's cut, garden produce through summer, odd work where she could find it, and the land itself held together by a combination of careful management and pure refusal. "How long have you been back?" he asked. 14 months. Alone?" She looked at the fence. "Maintaining it," she said, which was not the same thing as answering the question, and both of them understood that. Callum crouched at the nearest cut post and looked at the cut. Recent. Dry wood on the inside, not yet weathered to the same gray as the outer face. Within the last 2 weeks. "You report it?" "I reported the survey stakes 3 times. Nothing happened. The RCMP detachment is 40 minutes away, and they've got more pressing concerns than a property dispute in the county that everyone assumes I'll give up on eventually. Will you?" She turned and looked at him directly with a patience that had something underneath it that was not patience at all, but was choosing to present itself as patience because that was what the situation required. "No." she said. He believed her. That wasn't even a decision. It was just obviously true. He stood up. I'm going to send someone to look at the fence. I'd like your permission first. Why? Because it's your fence. She was quiet for a moment. There was a line she was working out. He could see it. Where the offer became obligation, where help became a handhold, where someone with more resources doing something for someone with fewer resources started to mean something complicated that would have to be dealt with later. What do you want for it? She asked. Nothing right now. Maybe a conversation later about the road allowance through your south quarter, but that's a separate discussion, and I'm not going to tie it to a fence repair you need, regardless of what we decide about anything else. She looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved through the spruce row behind the house, and a couple of dry leaves spun down between them. All right, she said. She did not say thank you, and he did not expect her to. The crew came 2 days later. 2 men Callum had worked with for years, quiet and skilled, the kind of workers who show up already knowing what needs doing and don't require direction for every step. Wren was out at the fence line when they arrived, her own post-hole digger already in the truck bed. She pulled on work gloves and went to the far end of the section without being asked. One of the men, a heavy-set Métis fellow named Earl, watched her for a moment and then nodded, in the way that workers nod to each other when no explanation is necessary. She worked the line with them through the morning. It was the kind of work that asks everything of your shoulders and gives nothing to your mind, and she moved through it with a focus that was partly efficiency and partly, he thought later when Earl described it to him, a kind of relief. Something that required physical effort and had a visible result at the end of it. Progress you could measure in posts. By midday, they had 6 posts set and 2 sections of wire run. The ground was harder than it looked, and one section required a different anchor approach than they'd planned. Wren modified the configuration on her own initiative, braced against the problem, and solved it in about 4 minutes without consulting anyone. Earl came to Callum that evening and said, simply, "She knows what she's doing out there." Which, from Earl, was approximately the highest praise available. Callum arrived on the second afternoon with a document. It was not a contract. He'd been careful about that, because a contract implies a transaction, and he didn't want to frame what he was proposing as a transaction. It was a letter of agreement, 2 pages, outlining a grazing arrangement for the creek bottom pasture on the eastern edge of the Pickett property, seasonal use, fair market rate per acre per month, and a clause that made him responsible for any fence damage caused by his cattle. Wren read it at the kitchen table while he sat across from her with a cup of coffee she'd made without asking if he wanted it, which he took as a good sign. "You added a winter access clause," she said. "If I've got cattle on your creek pasture in October and the temperature drops fast, I need to be able to pull them at night without calling ahead. That's for both of our benefit." She looked at the clause again. "You've defined emergency here," she said. "That's good. Some people leave that vague on purpose." "I know." She turned the page. "You've also put a cap on the number of animal units. What happens if you're over that number?" "Then I'm in breach, and the daily rate doubles." She looked up. He met her eyes. "That's not the standard practice," she said. "No." Another pause. She looked back down at the document. "Why?" "Because it protects you," he said. "And because I don't intend to breach it, so the clause costs me nothing." Something shifted in her expression. Not warmth, precisely. More like the recalibration of an estimate. She read the document a 3rd time. Then she picked up the pen he'd left on the table and signed it on the 2nd page, the picket line, and pushed it back to him. "I'll want a copy," she said. "Already made one." He slid it across. She folded it in thirds and set it on the table beside her, and for a moment they both sat in the quiet of the house, which had the particular quiet of a place that is usually empty of voices. The man who wanted the land was named Derek Osman. He was based out of Lethbridge, ran a land acquisition company that had been active in the southern Alberta foothills for 4 years, and had developed a reputation in the county for appearing at exactly the right moment, which was to say, at the wrong moment for whoever he was visiting. 3 families had sold to him. 2 of them had later said, publicly, that they hadn't fully understood what they'd agreed to until it was already done. The 3rd had moved away and wasn't speaking about it. He drove a black truck that was too clean for the roads out here, and he arrived on a Tuesday morning in mid-October when Wren was mulching the last of the garden beds for winter. She heard him before she saw him, the sound of a vehicle moving too fast on the gravel approach. Then slowing too late. The kind of driving that says the person behind the wheel doesn't think the road deserves attention. He was pleasant. That was the first thing she noticed. Not polite. Pleasant, which is a different thing entirely. Polite means you're considering the other person. Pleasant means you've decided on an outcome and you're moving toward it with a smile. He introduced himself with a card and a handshake and got straight to the number, $280,000. Clean title transfer, 30-day close, he'd cover the legal fees. Wren pulled off one glove and took the card. She looked at it for a moment, then set it on top of the fence post nearest to her. The property is currently under a grazing agreement, she said. Creek bottom pasture, signed and registered with the county land office. Leaseholder is Callum Bryce, Whitehorn Cattle. Something in Derek Osmond's pleasantness changed frequency without changing expression. Still smiling, but the smile had relocated to somewhere behind his eyes where it was doing a different job. Grazing leases are short-term instruments, he said. They don't affect a clean title transfer in any meaningful way. The clause I included runs with the land for 3 years and has a first right of refusal trigger if the property is listed. She looked at him steadily. It was registered before your visit. That wasn't an accident. He let the silence go a few seconds longer than was comfortable. One of the techniques she recognized, space that's meant to feel like wait, like the world waiting for you to stop being difficult. Miss Pickett, warmer now slightly. Repositioning. I understand there's an attachment here, but this is a significant offer for a property in its current condition. There are carrying costs to consider, maintenance, taxes. The winters out here aren't gentle to a structure like this without sustained investment. I know what the winters are like, she said. I've been here 14 months, and before that you were in Calgary. He said it pleasantly, like offering helpful context. Meaning, before that you were somewhere else. Meaning, this isn't really yours. Meaning, someone who knows what they're doing would take the money. Wren looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her glove from the fence post and pulled it back on. This property is not for sale, she said. If you come onto it again without an invitation, I'll have the county sheriff here before you get back to the road. Good morning. She picked up her fork and went back to the mulch. He stood for a moment. Then he walked back to the truck, and she didn't watch him go. But she heard it, the door closing with the exact amount of force that a person uses when they want to communicate displeasure without doing anything that could be described as a scene. He drove back up the track, faster than he should have on gravel. She stood in the cold garden and breathed slowly and waited for her hands to stop being tight. Then she went inside and wrote it down. Date, time, name, offer, her response. She wrote it in the property ledger she'd been keeping since she arrived, the same ledger where she recorded fence repairs and well water levels, and the date the first hard frost took the tomatoes. If Osmond was going to be a problem, she wanted the problem documented from the first word. She called Callum that evening. He didn't ask many questions. He listened, asked her to read back Osmond's exact phrasing where she could remember it, and then was quiet for a moment. I'll come out Thursday, he said. You don't need to. I know I don't need to. A pause, brief and plain. I'll come Thursday. He arrived Thursday afternoon with his ranch manager, a long-limbed woman from the Peace Country named Judith Sawchuk, who had the quiet authority of someone who had seen a great many things go sideways and had developed, over the years, a talent for making sure they didn't. Judith sat at the kitchen table and looked at the ledger entries Wren had made. All of them, back to the first day, with the focused attention of someone who understood that documentation was a form of power when used correctly. You noted the survey stake incidents, Judith said. 3 times. I've got photographs. Judith looked at Callum. That changes things, she said. Osmond came back on Saturday. He came with a colleague this time, a younger man who carried a tablet and said nothing but took notes on everything, and he came with a revised offer. $310,000 with an additional payment contingent on a clean environmental assessment. Callum was at the fence line on the south boundary when the black truck came up the road. He was checking the anchor posts on the new wire, which did not require him to be there that day, and both he and Wren understood that, and neither of them said anything about it. Osmond took in the scene at the gate. Wren, Callum, and Judith standing 15 meters apart in a loose triangle that was not exactly a formation, but was not exactly not one either. He recalibrated, visibly, just for a moment. "Miss Pickett," he said with the pleasantness fully reinstated. "I wasn't expecting company. This is Callum Bryce," Wren said. "He holds the grazing agreement on the creek pasture, and Judith Sawchuk, his ranch manager. I've asked them to be here." Osmond nodded at Callum with the neutral acknowledgement men give each other when they are figuring out the arrangement. "Mr. Bryce, Mr. Osmond." Callum put his hands in his coat pockets. "Judith mentioned you've been active in the county. Quite a few acquisitions. It's been a productive few years. Still pleasant, still smiling. 310,000 is a fair number," Callum said, "particularly given the current state of the structures." He let that sit for a moment, and the moment was precise. Of course, the survey stake interference changes the liability picture somewhat, and with the lease registered as it is, any buyer would need to either honor the agreement or litigate it, which adds cost and time to a 30-day close. Osmond's colleague stopped taking notes. "I wasn't aware of survey stake interference," Osmond said. His voice had leveled out somewhere below the pleasantness. Not threatening, just flatter. "There's documentation," Judith said from where she stood. "Photographs, dates, incident reports with the county land office. The RCMP file numbers are attached." A silence settled over the yard. A magpie landed on the fence post nearest the gate and sat there for a moment, black and white and completely indifferent, then lifted off. Osmond looked at Wren. She looked back at him without moving. "The offer stands," he said. "I'll leave it open." "I'll give you the same answer I gave you Tuesday," she said. "This land is not for sale. Not to you, not at any number you're going to put in front of me. If there was any confusion about that the first time, I want to make sure there isn't now." Osmond looked at Callum one more time, the look of a man doing a quick calculation about whether there was a side door somewhere, and finding that there wasn't. He touched the brim of his cap. He got in the truck. He drove out. Judith watched the truck until it was out of sight on the main road. "First time I've watched him leave without the folder," she said quietly. Wren heard that. She filed it away and said nothing. Word moves in small communities the way weather moves. You don't see it traveling, but you feel it arriving. Within 2 weeks, Wren had been stopped twice in town, once at the hardware store and once at the feed co-op, by people she didn't know well who had heard something about what had happened at the picket place. A rancher named Doug Pemberton told her directly, at the co-op, that Osmond had approached him the previous spring, and that he wished he'd had documentation ready the way she had. She told him to start a ledger. He wrote that down. Callum heard it too from the land recorder at the county office, a deliberate man named Everett who had worked that decks for 22 years and had seen most of what land could do to people and people could do to land. "I heard Osmond left the picket property empty," Everett said when Callum came in to register an updated water license. "He did." Everett looked up from his stamps. "You know what you did? Putting your name on that grazing agreement when the fence was still down and the title was in question. I know. Every speculator in the district is going to think twice about a property with your paperwork on it." Callum looked at the counter. "That was the idea." Everett shook his head slowly. "Most men with your operation just buy the parcel." She didn't want to sell. Everett was quiet for a moment, stamping the edges of the document with the rhythm of a man who works without hurry because he has always worked without hurry and it has served him well. "In 22 years," he said, "I don't think I've seen a rancher with your square footage take no for an answer from a woman with a fence down and a roof going soft." He set the stamp aside. "Usually that's when they make an offer." "She didn't need an offer," Callum said. "She needed a fence." Everett looked at him over his reading glasses. "And now she's got one." A pause. "And you've got a creek crossing." "I've got a fair agreement." "You've got that too," Everett said. Callum drove back out to the Pickett property that afternoon and told Wren what had been said. She was in the barn checking the load-bearing capacity of the new Eastern Purlin they'd sistered in beside the old one 3 weeks prior. She'd been watching it through the first freeze cycle to see how it settled. She listened to what Everett had said without stopping what she was doing. When Callum finished, she set down the flashlight and turned. "He's right," she said. "That is not a thing that happens." She said it without any particular surprise, just an accurate reading of the situation stated plainly. "Thank you, Callum." First name. She'd used his given name before, practically when the context was specific, pointing at something, directing the crew. This was different. This was just his name, standing alone. He didn't make anything of it. He noticed. October ran cold into November, and November turned serious. The creek froze from the edges inward, the way it always does, building gray shelves of ice toward the dark water, still running in the center. Callum's cattle crossed 3 times a week on the established crossing, and Wren tracked each movement in the ledger. Ice conditions, bank state, weather at time of crossing, and sent weekly summaries to Callum by email. He replied to each one, brief, specific, sometimes adding context about what he was seeing from the herd side. Once he noted that the bank on the east approach was compacting differently than the west, and asked if she'd noticed. She had noticed. She'd been about to write it up. They spent 3 emails on the question of whether the approach needed rerouting or deflection, and settled on deflection, and she built the branch and rock structure on a gray Friday afternoon in late November, alone, with her hands cold enough that she had to stop twice to warm them in her coat pockets. She wrote in the summary that evening, "East approach deflector installed. 2 courses, branch and rock, should distribute weight sufficiently for the rest of the season." She sent it. He replied the next morning, "Good work. That'll hold." That was the entire message. She read it twice and then closed the laptop and went to split the day's wood. He came in person the 3rd Tuesday of December, ostensibly to check the crossing before the heaviest cattle movement before Christmas. She was at the creek bank when he arrived, crouching over a section of bank she'd been watching, where the ice formation was unusual. More pressure from the upstream side than the downstream, which didn't match the current pattern and suggested something was changing in the bed above. "There's a beaver dam forming about 40 meters upstream," she said without looking up. "I found the first signs last week. If it goes in fully before the ground freezes, it'll change the whole water table on this side of the creek." He crouched beside her. She was right. He could see the slowed current in the way the ice was building. "Do you want to remove it or manage around it?" "Manage around it," she said. "They were here before the fence line was. If the dam goes in and holds, it'll raise the water table in the east pasture, and I might be able to put in a small market garden next summer without hauling water." He looked at her. She looked at the ice. "You've been thinking about next summer," he said. "I think about every summer. That's how you get through winter." They stood. Neither moved away particularly fast. "These summaries you've been sending," he said. "Whoever manages this land in 20 years is going to know exactly how this creek behaves in every condition. That kind of knowledge usually disappears when the person who holds it does." She looked at him sideways. "You've been thinking about who manages this land in 20 years. "I have," he said. The cold sat clean and deep around them. The spruce at the creek edge moved slightly in a wind that didn't reach them down in the bank. "Miss Pickett," he said, in a tone that was precise and unhurried in a way she'd come to recognize. I'd like to talk about whether the arrangement between us might look different. Going forward, more permanent, she held his gaze. You're not talking about the grazing agreement? No, she didn't answer immediately. She was not a person who answered things that deserved consideration with less than consideration. She answered him 4 days later. She drove to the Whitehorn Ranch on a Thursday morning, frost on everything, no ceremony about it. She found him in the equipment shed, working on the hydraulic line of the old loader that had been giving trouble since August. He heard her truck and came out and waited. I have requirements, she said. Something moved through his expression. Quiet. Specific. The Pickett property stays registered in my name, separately, not folded into anything, not attached to anything. My name on the title. Yes, I manage the creek bottom records and I keep the ledger system intact. It's been running 14 months and I'm not starting over. I wouldn't ask you to. And I don't become incidental. She looked at him steadily. If I'm part of this operation, I'm part of it, not a supporting role. He looked back at her. I sent my crew to your fence because Earl told me afterward that you'd pulled the post hole digger out of the truck before he'd even unlocked the gate. I've known what I was looking at since October. The cold morning sat around them. A raven called from somewhere in the spruce. Then we're agreed, she said. She put out her hand. He shook it, the same way as the first time. Firm, direct, no performance. Not rescue, not sentiment. Two people who had looked at the same situation from different angles and reached the same conclusion about what made sense. Spring came the way it comes to that part of Alberta, reluctantly, testing the ground for weeks before it committed. The creek ran clear under the last gray ice, the beaver dam held, and the east pasture showed the first green at the edges by the 3rd week of April. The fence line on the east and south held through the whole winter, through freeze and thaw and a February windstorm that took down 40 meters of a neighbor's line half a kilometer away. The garden went in the last week of May. Wren turned the first beds in the early morning when the light was still low and blue against the mountains. She heard Callum's truck in the yard while she was on the 3rd row. She looked up. Potatoes this year? He said from the garden edge. Potatoes and dry beans, rotating off the area I rested last season. He nodded. Sound plan. They stood in the morning for a moment, the two of them in the pale spring light, and the mountains behind everything like they always are in that country, older than any agreement, older than any deed, indifferent to the small human business of who holds what and why, and whether they mean to keep it. There is a kind of wealth that has nothing to do with acreage or cattle numbers, or how many properties have your name on the registration. It moves quietly, mostly. It shows up in a ledger entry written in careful handwriting at the end of a long day. It shows up in a fence line that holds through February, in the deliberate placement of a branch and rock deflector on a creek bank in November, done alone, in the cold because the work needed doing. Callum Bryce had built something real in 60 years. What he'd found on the Pickett property in September was something realer still. A person who understood that the strongest thing you can build is not a fence, or a barn, or a cattle operation, but an agreement made in good faith between people who have looked each other in the eye and told the truth about what they need and what they're willing to give. The deed for the creek bottom agreement is still in the county land office, registered under both names exactly as written. Neither of them needed to frame it. They both knew exactly what it meant. You've been riding with shadows of the lone West, where the West is told the way it was, cold and clear and honest. Leave a comment. Tell me every single one. Subscribe. The next story is already waiting. The next story is already waiting.